While my husband and mother-in-law were enjoying Paris, what I discovered at home changed everything. David Montenegro, patriarch of one of the country's most influential families, lived surrounded by luxury but isolated by the emptiness left by the death of his beloved wife, Clara. His mansion, a symbol of power and wealth, now felt like nothing more than a museum of painful memories, filled with portraits and objects that evoked a past when he. In recent months, David had started to grow suspicious of his son, Michael, and his daughter-in-law, Julia. Their visits to the mansion had become more frequent, always accompanied by forced smiles and exaggerated displays of concern. Although they tried to hide their intentions, David's experience allowed him to perceive the tension and sense that their interest extended far beyond his health or well-being. It was clear to him that Clara, had she been alive, would have noticed this long bf. Determined to uncover the truth, David devised a bold and risky plan. He would pretend to be gravely ill, creating a scenario where Michael and Julia would be forced to reveal their true intentions. With the help of an old friend who was a doctor, he crafted a false diagnosis, complete with medical tests and medications that would lend credibility to his deception. The announcement took place during a formal dinner, with everyone gathered around the long dark wooden table, where the candelabras glowed under the light of the grand crystal chandelier. David, wearing a serious expression, revealed that he had been diagnosed with a rare terminal illness. The impact rippled through the room like a silent wave. Emily, Michael's young stepdaughter, was the only one who reacted with genuine emotion. Her eyes welled with tears as she asked with concern how she could help him. Julia, on the other hand, assumed a theatrical posture, promising to take care of everything and be the support he needed, though her syrupy tone rang hollow. Michael, always cold and pragmatic, asked vague questions about the treatment, but his distant and thoughtful gaze betrayed that his mind was already elsewhere. That night, the mansion's hallways seemed quieter than ever, as if the entire house was holding its breath. While Emily watched David with sincere worry, Julia whispered something to Michael, believing no one could hear them. But David, now playing the role of a frail and resigned man, simply observed, waiting for the next acts of his own play to unfold. The next day, the mansion was steeped in a strange mix of unease and apparent normalcy. Julia, with her usual air of control, offered to prepare breakfast for David, a gesture she rarely made. As she placed the tray on the dining room table, her movements were precise, but her eyes betrayed a barely contained tension. Michael, sitting across from her, kept a serious expression. He seemed to be calculating something, his gaze fixed on the window overlooking the garden. David, seated at the head of the table, observed every detail, pretending to be lost in his own thoughts. It was Emily who broke the silence. "Grandpa, can I come with you to the doctor today? I want to be there for you," she said warmly and sincerely, delicately taking David's hand. David smiled faintly, touched by her gesture. Before he could respond, Julia quickly interjected. "Oh, dear, don't worry about that. I'll take care of accompanying him. You can stay here and rest." Emily looked up at Julia, surprised by her condescending tone. However, she nodded, trying to avoid a confrontation. David, sensing the tension, chose to remain silent. It was clear that Julia was trying to monopolize the situation, perhaps to gain leverage or prevent Emily from having any influence over him. Later, as Julia and Michael spoke privately in the library, David discreetly activated a microphone he had installed days earlier. From his study, he listened to every word. "This could be our opportunity, Michael. If we play our cards right, we could convince him to transfer control of the company to us before his condition worsens," Julia whispered, her tone full of determination. "I'm not so sure. My father is sharper than he seems." "He won't give up anything without a good reason," Michael replied cautiously. "Then we'll create a good reason. We could tell him it's to secure Emily's future. You know he's always had a soft spot for her." David clenched his fists as he listened. Julia's words confirmed his worst fears. Not only were they planning to take advantage of him, but they were also willing to use Emily as an excuse. That afternoon, Emily found David in the greenhouse, his favorite place to reflect. He was seated in a wicker chair, surrounded by the plants Clara had so lovingly cared for during her life. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" "You seem deep in thought," Emily asked, approaching cautiously. David looked up and smiled faintly. "I'm fine, my dear. I'm just thinking about how the most beautiful flowers sometimes grow among thorns." Emily didn't fully understand, but she felt the weight of David's words. She decided not to press further, though the feeling of worry lingered. That night, as the mansion fell into an eerie silence, David sat at his desk and wrote a letter, which he carefully placed in a drawer. It was a message for Emily, a letter containing his deepest thoughts and a warning that would only be revealed when the time was right. The next morning, the air in the mansion felt heavier than usual. Julia and Michael seemed restless, while Emily spent her time tending to the plants in the greenhouse, seeking comfort in the space that reminded her so much of Clara. David, meanwhile, was in his study, reviewing documents and preparing the next step in his plan. Before noon, David summoned everyone to the main hall. Julia and Michael exchanged quick glances, trying to guess what he might want. Emily arrived last, her hands still covered in soil, giving her a simple, natural appearance that stood in stark contrast to Julia's exaggerated elegance. David, with a solemn expression, rose from his armchair and spoke in a calm yet firm tone. "I've been reflecting a lot about the future. This illness has made me realize that time is limited, and I want to ensure that everything Clara and I built serves a greater purpose." Julia frowned slightly, trying to mask her discomfort, while Michael leaned forward, listening intently. "For that reason," David continued, "I've decided to reorganize my assets." The room fell into complete silence. Julia let out a slight cough, probably to conceal her nervousness. "I am going to establish a foundation in Clara's name. Its mission will be to support underserved communities and to preserve our family's legacy through acts of service." Emily's eyes widened with amazement. It was the first time she had heard something so noble from someone in her circle. "That sounds wonderful, Grandpa," Emily said sincerely, smiling as she moved closer to him. "And what about the company?" Michael interrupted, unable to hide the worry in his voice. David looked at him steadily, his expression unreadable. "The company will continue operating, but not as a personal asset. All profits will go to the foundation. This is the legacy I want to leave behind." Julia, feeling the conversation slipping out of her control, intervened with a forced smile. "That's very generous of you, David, but don't you think it's also important to secure the family's well-being?" David nodded slowly, as if considering her words, but then responded with a calmness that disarmed Julia. "The well-being of this family should not depend on inheritances. It must be built through hard work and values, something Clara always believed in." Emily looked at her grandfather with admiration, while Julia pressed her lips together, and Michael slumped into the couch, frustrated. That night, in the privacy of their bedroom, Julia vented her anger on Michael. "This is a disaster. If we don't do something, we'll lose everything," she shouted, pacing back and forth. Michael, lying on the bed, kept his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "Maybe it's time to let it go, Julia. My father isn't going to budge. Let it go." Julia stopped abruptly, staring at him in disbelief. "If we let this happen, what will we have left?" "Nothing." Michael sighed. "If we keep pushing, we might lose more than we already have." With fury in her eyes, Julia stormed out of the room, leaving Michael in reflective silence. Meanwhile, David sat in his study, reviewing the final documents for the foundation. He felt a mix of relief and sadness but knew he was making the right choice. On his desk lay an envelope with Emily's name written on it in his handwriting, a reminder that she would be key to preserving the true spirit of the Montenegro family. A few days later, David arranged a private meeting with his trusted lawyer in the mansion's study. Emily, curious about the unusual activity, passed near the door but respected her grandfather's privacy. It wasn't until she noticed Julia lingering in the hallway, pretending to adjust a vase on the table, that Emily began to suspect something was going on. With her characteristic cunning, Julia managed to overhear fragments of the conversation through the slightly ajar door. "So, Mr. Montenegro, you want the properties and primary assets to be transferred to the foundation immediately?" asked the lawyer, reviewing the documents. "Exactly. I want everything secured before," David paused, as if emotion had stolen his words. "Before it's too late." Julia stepped back silently, her face tense and her fists clenched. She quickly descended the stairs and went straight to find Michael, who was in the game room sorting through old photographs. "He's transferring everything, Michael. Everything to the foundation. If we don't act now, we'll be left with nothing." Michael set the photos aside and rubbed his face with his hands. "Julia, we've talked about this. If he goes through with it, there's nothing we can do." "There is something," Julia shouted, losing her composure. "He's not well, Michael. His illness is making him irrational. We need to intervene legally or at least force a situation that will make him change his mind." Michael looked at her wearily, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was considering her words. That night, while Julia and Michael strategized, David decided to take the next step in his plan. He headed to the north wing of the mansion, where Emily often spent her evenings reading in the small sitting room. When he found her, she was engrossed in a book on botany, surrounded by the warm glow of a lamp. "Emily, do you have a moment?" David asked as he entered slowly. "Of course, Grandpa. Is everything all right?" David sat down across from her, his expression serious but calm. "I want to talk to you about something important. I've decided to entrust you with a crucial role in the foundation I'm creating." Emily looked at him, surprised, setting the book aside. "Me? But I'm not sure I'm ready for something like this." David smiled softly. "Clara always said you had a pure heart, and I see it every day. This foundation isn't just about business, Emily. It's about values, compassion, and justice, things you embody naturally." Emily felt a lump in her throat. She had spent so many years being ignored by Michael and Julia that hearing those words from David was almost overwhelming. "I'll do my best, Grandpa. I won't let you down." "You never would, my dear." Meanwhile, frustrated by Michael's inaction, Juliet decided to take matters into her own hands. She snuck into David's study while he slept and began searching through his papers for something she could use to stop the asset transfer. What she found was far more devastating, a folder containing audio recordings and copies of conversations where she and Michael had plotted to take advantage of David. Julia quickly closed the folder, her heart racing. She knew she was in danger. David hadn't just discovered their intentions, he had the evidence to destroy them. Now, more than ever, she needed to find a way to seize control before it was too late. At dawn, Julia already had a new plan. But David was also ready for the next move, confident that the pieces of his familial chess game were about to fall into their exact places. At dawn, David stood in the greenhouse, gazing at the flowers Clara had lovingly nurtured. He knew the final confrontation with Julia and Michael was inevitable, but he felt an unusual calm. The pieces were in place, and Emily, with her innocence and resilience, was now the beacon guiding his plan. Julia, however, wasted no time. Taking advantage of David's distraction, she headed straight to the study. She carried an envelope containing falsified documents, crafted to cast doubt on David's mental capacity. Her goal was to use these papers to initiate a legal process that would block the transfer of assets to the foundation. When Julia entered the study, she found Michael already there. "What are you doing here?" Julia asked, suspicious. "I could ask you the same," Michael replied, crossing his arms. "I don't trust you anymore, Julia. You're crossing lines you shouldn't." Julia scoffed, frustrated. "If you're not willing to fight for what's ours, I'll do it myself." Michael looked at her in silence for a moment, then stepped closer. What if he knows everything, Julia? What if this illness is a lie? Julia froze. The possibility that it was all a trap had never fully crossed her mind. But before she could respond, they heard approaching footsteps. It was David who entered the study calmly, holding a cup of tea. I see you two are up early, he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Julia tried to hide the envelope behind her back, but David noticed the movement. Something interesting, he asked casually, though his gaze remained fixed on Julia. Michael, unable to bear the tension, took a step back. Julia, on the other hand, tried to regain control. David, this is getting out of hand. We just don't want you to make a mistake you'll regret later. David let out a dry, determined laugh. The only mistake I made was not realizing sooner what you really are. Julia tried to interrupt, but David raised a hand, stopping her. Last night, I reviewed everything, the recordings, the conversations, the attempts at manipulation. I know everything, Julia. Julia turned pale, but before she could react, Michael spoke. Father, I didn't want it to go this far. I'm sorry. David looked at him with a mix of disappointment and sadness. Regret comes too late, Michael. But at least it's something. Julia, on the other hand, still thinks she can manipulate everyone around her. Feeling cornered, Julia finally revealed her true colors. This is all your fault, old man. You never trusted us, never gave us a chance. David interrupted her with a colder tone. Opportunities aren't given, Julia. They're earned. And you clearly don't know what that means. With calm precision, David pulled a folder from the desk. This is the final document transferring all my assets to the foundation. It's already signed and registered. There's nothing you can do to stop it. Julia was frozen in place, while Michael slumped into a chair, defeated. Without another word, David left the study. He walked to the greenhouse, where he found Emily watering the plants. Seeing her, his expression softened. Everything is ready, Emily. The foundation is yours. Emily looked at him, startled. Mine. But Grandpa, David interrupted her with a warm smile. Clara would be proud of you. I know I am. This is our legacy, and I know it's in the best hands. As the sunlight streamed into the greenhouse, Emily felt, for the first time, that her place in the Montenegro family was clear. Julia and Michael, meanwhile, realized their time in the mansion had come to an end. The days that followed in the Montenegro mansion were marked by a tense calm. Julia, consumed by anger and frustration, continued plotting ways to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. Michael, on the other hand, seemed resigned, spending long hours in the garden, lost in thought. Emily, for her part, was absorbed in the responsibilities David had begun to delegate to her. One afternoon, as Emily reviewed documents related to the foundation in the main living room, Julia abruptly entered. Her eyes were filled with determination, but her smile was unsettlingly calculated. Emily, dear, could I have a word with you? She asked, her tone so sweet it was suspicious. Emily, though surprised, nodded. Of course, Mrs. Julia. Julia sat across from her, crossing her legs with studied elegance. I've been thinking a lot about what's happening with the family. This foundation idea is noble, of course, but I think David is putting too much responsibility on you. After all, you're young and inexperienced. Emily calmly closed the documents, her eyes never leaving Julia's. Grandpa trusts me, and I'll do everything I can to prove him right. Julia let out a light laugh, as if she had anticipated that response. Of course, dear, but important decisions require wisdom, and that comes with age. I think it would be better if Michael and I took a more active role. We could supervise operations, ensure everything runs smoothly. Emily saw through the game instantly. Julia wasn't there to offer help, she was trying to regain control. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Julia, but Grandpa made it very clear that this is my responsibility. I don't think I need any supervision." For a moment, Julia's face hardened, but she quickly forced a smile. "I understand, dear. I just wanted to help." She rose with elegance and left the room, but not before giving Emily a glance filled with subtle warning. That night, Julia met with Michael in the study, where their whispers filled the room once more. "Emily won't budge. She's protected by David. And as long as he's here, we have no chance," Julia said, her fists clenched. Michael looked at her, weary of the constant scheming. "So, what's your plan now? We can't do anything without putting ourselves at risk." Julia stepped closer, her eyes fixed on his. "If David isn't here, everything changes." Michael recoiled, horrified. "Are you suggesting that?" Julia cut him off, her tone cold. "Don't misunderstand me, Michael. But we need to act. I won't sit back and watch us lose everything." Michael left the study without a word, but the growing darkness in Julia's eyes was undeniable. Meanwhile, from his room, David reviewed the latest recordings he had obtained. Although he had hoped his confrontation with Julia and Michael would be enough to stop their attempts, it was now clear that Julia wouldn't give up so easily. The next morning, David summoned Emily to the greenhouse. "Emily, there's something I need to ask of you," he said, his seriousness alarming her. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" David handed her a sealed envelope. "If anything happens to me, this envelope must go directly to the authorities. Promise me you'll do it." Emily felt a knot in her stomach but nodded, taking the envelope carefully. "Nothing will happen to you, Grandpa. I'll be here with you." David looked at her with a mixture of pride and sadness. "I know, my dear. That's why I trust you." As the morning sunlight bathed the greenhouse, Emily clutched the envelope to her chest, silently vowing to protect David's legacy no matter the cost. Julia, watching from a nearby window hidden in the shadows, was determined to take her next step, no matter how risky it might be. The tension in the Montenegro mansion reached a breaking point that night. Julia, now fully consumed by ambition, had decided it was time to act. In her mind, David was an obstacle, a wall that needed to be torn down to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. In the study, Julia meticulously arranged her plan while Michael sat silently in a chair across from her. "Michael, we need to be careful but firm. If we can make David appear incapable of managing his affairs, the authorities will have no choice but to give us control," Julia said, her voice low but filled with determination. Michael, exhausted by his wife's growing web of manipulation, shook his head. "What if this backfires, Julia? What if David has more evidence than we think?" Julia leaned toward him, her eyes flashing with anger. "Then we make sure he doesn't have the chance to use it." Meanwhile, elsewhere in the mansion, David walked slowly to the greenhouse, where Emily was still working on organizing the foundation's documents. As he entered, he noticed the worried expression on her face. "Is everything all right, Emily?" he asked, approaching the table where she was reviewing papers. Emily looked up, forcing a smile. "Yes, Grandpa, I'm just trying to make sure everything is in order." David placed a hand on her shoulder and gazed at her fondly. "You've done more than I could ever ask. I'm proud of you." Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over the mansion. Later that evening, Julia set the first phase of her plan into motion. Feigning concern for David's health, she offered him a cup of tea before he retired to his room. David, ever observant, noted Julia's unusual enthusiasm and accepted the tea with a cautious smile. After Julia left the room, David went to the bathroom and discreetly poured the tea down the sink, watching as the dark liquid swirled down the drain. Meanwhile, Julia returned to the study, where Michael waited anxiously. "Did he drink it?" he asked, unable to hide his nervousness. Julia nodded with a cold smile. With this, he should feel weak enough to justify our intervention. What Julia didn't know was that David had already anticipated her moves. That same night, as the mansion fell silent, David activated a hidden device in his room, a concealed camera that recorded everything. At dawn, David summoned Julia and Michael to the main dining room. Emily, though intrigued, stayed on the sidelines, observing from a prudent distance. "I've noticed you've been particularly interested in my well-being lately," David said dryly, his tone making Julia and Michael tense in their seats. "We're only trying to help you, Father. We know this illness is affecting your judgment," Julia replied, her smile calculated. David let out a small laugh as he rose from his chair. "Is that what you think?" He pulled a small device from his pocket and placed it on the table. It was a projector. With a click, it began to display images and recordings, conversations of Julia and Michael conspiring, manipulative schemes, and even the scene of Julia pouring a suspicious powder into his tea. The silence in the room was deafening. Julia shot to her feet, trying to defend herself. "This is manipulation. You're twisting the facts." Michael, however, lowered his head, unable to meet his father's gaze. "There's nothing more to say," David said firmly. "All of this will be handed over to the authorities. I've already taken the necessary steps to protect my legacy." Defeated, Julia turned to Michael. "Do something." But Michael remained silent, knowing they had lost. With a calm but steely resolve, David looked at Julia one last time. "It's time for you to leave. This mansion is no longer your home." As Julia and Michael left the room, Emily approached David, who seemed more at peace than he had in a long time. "Grandpa, will this ever end?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. David looked at her tenderly. "In time, Emily. But what matters is that you're here to preserve what truly matters." As the morning sun began to illuminate the mansion, Emily realized that the true legacy of the Montenegro family was now in the right hands. After the confrontation, the Montenegro mansion fell into an eerie silence. That same afternoon, Julia and Michael packed their belongings quickly. Julia, her jaw clenched and her eyes filled with restrained fury, cast icy glances at every corner of the house, as if trying to imprint in her memory the place she believed was unjustly taken from her. Michael, on the other hand, seemed defeated, moving mechanically as he gathered his things. From a second-floor window, Emily watched them leave. There was no joy in her heart, only a mix of relief and melancholy. She knew that, even though they were gone, the wounds of their betrayal would take time to heal. When Julia and Michael's car disappeared behind the tall trees lining the estate, David entered the study, calling Emily to join him. "This is a new beginning, Emily," he said as he opened an intricately carved wooden cabinet that had remained sealed for years. From inside, he pulled out a collection of documents, folders, and a wooden box engraved with Clara's monogram. Emily looked on curiously as David placed everything on the large study table. "This box contains the letters Clara wrote about the dreams she had for our family. Her vision was always to create something that would benefit others, something greater than our wealth." Emily touched the box delicately, as though it were a priceless treasure. "Do you want me to read these letters, Grandpa?" David nodded. "They're yours now. They'll guide you in the right direction as you lead the foundation." That night, Emily read each letter under the soft glow of an antique lamp. In every word Clara wrote, Emily found love, hope, and an unshakable passion for helping others. By the time she closed the last letter, she felt a new fire burning inside her. The next morning, the mansion buzzed with renewed energy. Emily threw herself into building the foundation's framework, scheduling meetings with lawyers, accountants, and community leaders. The mansion transformed from a symbol of intrigue and shattered ambitions into the beating heart of a project filled with purpose. However, as Emily moved forward with enthusiasm, Julia was plotting her next move from a modest house in the city. She had hired a shady lawyer to explore potential ways to claim a share of the family's assets. "I won't let them strip me of what's mine," she told Michael one evening, as he watched her in silence, growing more distant with each passing day. Back at the mansion, Emily continued to build Clara's legacy with unbreakable determination. Under her leadership, the foundation began to take shape, focusing on education, healthcare, and housing for vulnerable communities. One day, as Emily reviewed proposals for the foundation's first projects, David entered the office with a warm smile on his face. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you, Emily. Everything you're doing, it's exactly what she always dreamed of." Emily looked at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you, Grandpa." David shook his head gently. "You've had the strength inside you all along. You just needed the chance to show it." As the days passed, the foundation began to gain public recognition, attracting donations and support from across the community. Emily became a respected figure, not only for her work but also for the humility and passion with which she led every initiative. But in the shadows, Julia was still scheming. She refused to accept her defeat and was determined to prove that her ambition knew no bounds, even if it meant risking everything once again. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity for Emily and the foundation. Every corner of the Montenegro mansion transformed into a bustling operations center, where employees and volunteers worked tirelessly to launch the first projects. David, though increasingly frail, found a new vitality as he watched Clara's legacy come to life through his granddaughter. One morning, while Emily was reviewing documents in the greenhouse, David entered, leaning on his cane. "Emily, come with me. There's something I want to show you," he said, his smile tinged with mystery. Intrigued, Emily followed him to the mansion's basement, a place she had rarely visited. David lit an old kerosene lamp and walked to a dusty trunk. Opening it, he retrieved a photo album and several old documents. "This is part of our history," David explained, placing the papers on a table. Emily began examining them. They included records of donations, photos of Clara overseeing community projects, and letters of gratitude from people who had benefited from the Montenegro family's generosity in the past. "Your grandmother always believed that true wealth lies in what we can do for others. That's why, when we built this mansion, we dedicated part of our earnings to social projects. This was her dream, Emily, and now it's yours." Emily felt a lump in her throat at his words. "I promise to honor her legacy, Grandpa. I won't let you down." As the foundation gained momentum, Julia continued working secretly with her lawyer. She had discovered a legal loophole, a forgotten document she claimed could invalidate the transfer of assets to the foundation. "With this, we can destroy everything they've built," Julia told the lawyer, her eyes gleaming with a mix of triumph and vengeance. The lawyer, hesitant but enticed by the potential payout, agreed to file a formal lawsuit. The news reached the foundation one afternoon, just as Emily and David were celebrating the approval of their first community project. "What does this mean, Grandpa?" Emily asked, holding the legal notice in her trembling hands. David took it and read it silently, his eyes narrowing as he reached the end. "It's Julia. She never knew when to give up." Emily felt a mix of anger and despair. "But this could ruin everything. We could lose it all." David placed a steady hand on her shoulder and looked at her calmly. "We've come too far to let that happen, Emily. Trust me." That night, while Emily struggled to sleep, David pored over the case documents. He knew Julia had exploited a technicality, but he also knew he had something far more powerful, the truth. In the days that followed, the legal battle began to escalate. Julia appeared in the media, giving interviews where she cast herself as the victim of a family conspiracy. "I only want justice," she said convincingly in front of the cameras. "My husband and I have been unjustly displaced from what is rightfully ours." Watching the statements on television, Emily felt a storm of anger and sadness. "How can she lie like that?" she asked David, who remained calm beside her. "Lies have short legs, Emily. The truth will come to light in due time." Despite the scandal, the foundation received unexpected support from the community. Many people who had been helped by the Montenegro family in the past began speaking out publicly in their defense. "That family saved my business," a shopkeeper declared in a local interview. "I can't stay silent while they're attacked unfairly." Seeing public opinion turn against her, Julia began losing control. Michael, growing increasingly distant, finally confronted his wife. "This has gone too far, Julia. I can't keep doing this with you." Julia glared at him, her voice filled with fury. "You're a coward. You always have been." Without responding, Michael packed his belongings and left their small apartment. For the first time, Julia found herself utterly alone in her fight. At the Montenegro mansion, Emily received an important call from her lawyer. "Miss Emily, we found enough evidence to counter the lawsuit. The truth will be on our side in court." Emily smiled as she listened. The battle wasn't over yet, but hope was beginning to shine again. Hanging up, she turned to David, who watched her from his armchair. "Grandpa, we're going to win." David nodded with a calm smile. "I always knew you would, Emily. You're stronger than you think." As the days moved toward the final legal showdown, the Montenegro family prepared to prove that truth and values could triumph over even the darkest ambitions. The day of the trial arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Emily, dressed in an elegant black suit that reflected her seriousness and determination, sat beside David, who appeared calm but visibly frighlier. Julia entered shortly after, wearing a flashy dress and carrying an air of arrogance that poorly concealed her nerves. The judge began reviewing the case. Julia's lawyer argued that the transfer of assets to the foundation was invalid due to irregularities in the documentation and questioned David's mental capacity at the time of the decision. In a dramatic act, Julia even feigned tears as she spoke. "I never wanted it to come to this," she said, her voice trembling. "I love my family, but I can't sit back and watch as what is rightfully mine is taken away." Emily felt a knot in her stomach, but when she looked at David, he gave her a subtle nod, reminding her that everything was under control. David's lawyer, a seasoned and composed man, rose to present their defense. With measured calm, he explained that the transfer documents had been prepared and registered legally and that David, far from being incapable, had demonstrated clear and resolute judgment throughout the process. "But more important than the documents, Your Honor, is the truth. And for that, I have evidence that exposes the true intentions of Mrs. Julia Montenegro." At that moment, the lawyer presented the recordings and videos David had collected. Every conspiratorial word, every act of manipulation was laid bare before the judge and everyone present. Julia, visibly shaken, tried to interrupt. "This proves nothing. It's manipulation," she shouted, losing all semblance of composure. The judge silenced her with a strike of his gavel. "Mrs. Montenegro, maintain decorum or I will have you removed from this courtroom." Michael, who had decided to attend the trial but remained silent in the back of the room, lowered his head in shame. He knew the evidence was irrefutable. The final blow came when several people who had benefited from the Montenegro family were called as witnesses. Each spoke of how David and Clara had changed their lives with their generosity and how Emily was continuing that legacy through the foundation. "They are an example of what it means to give selflessly," said an elderly woman, tears streaming down her face. "Something so noble cannot be destroyed." Julia, increasingly cornered, finally lost control. "This is all David's fault. He always favored that orphan," she screamed, pointing at Emily with disdain. The judge regarded her with stern disapproval. "Mrs. Montenegro, your comments are not only inappropriate but reflect the character in question in this trial." By the end of the day, the judge ruled in favor of David and Emily. The transfer of assets to the foundation was declared fully valid, and Julia was sanctioned for attempting to manipulate the judicial system with false evidence. As the trial concluded, Julia left the courtroom with a vacant expression. Michael, though distant from her, approached. "This is the end, Julia. I can't stay with you anymore. She didn't respond, simply walking away and disappearing into the crowd. On the other side of the room, Emily embraced David, feeling the weight of the battle finally lift. We did it, Grandpa. We did it. David, with a weak but satisfied smile, nodded. It wasn't just for us, Emily. It was for Clara and everything she stood for. That night, back at the mansion, a small gathering was held with the Foundation's staff. The atmosphere was one of hope and gratitude, and though the journey had been difficult, Emily knew it was just the beginning. David, sitting in a quiet corner, watched his granddaughter interact with the others. His eyes held pride and peace. He knew Clara's legacy was in the right hands. As the mansion's lights shone brightly, Emily silently vowed to protect that legacy with everything she had, no matter what the future might bring. In the days following the trial, the Montenegro mansion returned to being a place of calm and purpose. Emily, now recognized as the new leader of the family's legacy, dedicated long hours to planning the Foundation's first projects. Yet, there was something in the air that reminded her peace was never eternal. One afternoon, while reviewing proposals in the greenhouse, she received an unexpected call. Miss Montenegro, this is Inspector Ramirez. There's something you need to know, said a firm voice on the other end. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. What is it, Inspector? It's about Mrs. Julia Montenegro. She's been seen meeting with individuals of questionable reputation. It seems she's exploring less than legal methods to reclaim what she believes is hers. Emily thanked him for the call and hung up, feeling a mix of worry and exhaustion. She knew Julia wouldn't give up so easily, but she also trusted that the measures she and David had put in place would protect the Foundation's legacy. That evening, while dining together in the mansion's grand dining room, Emily shared the news with David. The inspector called me. He thinks Julia is scheming again, she said, setting her knife and fork down on her plate. David, who had been gazing at the fireplace, sighed deeply. I knew she wouldn't give up, but we can't let that distract us. She's playing with fire, and it will end up burning her. Emily nodded, though she couldn't shake the growing unease she felt. A few days later, the Foundation's first project, a community education center for vulnerable children, was inaugurated with great success. The local press covered the event, and Emily, delivering a heartfelt and emotional speech, won over everyone in attendance. This is not just a building, she said, her eyes glistening with emotion. It's a beacon of hope, a place where dreams can begin, and where every child can imagine a brighter future. David, seated among the guests, watched her with pride. But as applause filled the air, a familiar figure observed from the shadows at the edge of the crowd, Julia. That same night, Julia reconnected with the unscrupulous lawyer she had worked with before. This time, her plan was even darker. She had decided to sabotage the Foundation's operations directly, hoping to discredit Emily and force the authorities to intervene. Meanwhile, at the mansion, David called Emily into his study. There's something else I need to give you, he said, opening an old drawer in his desk. He pulled out a sealed envelope, similar to the one he had given her weeks earlier. What is this, Grandpa? Emily asked, curious. It's a last resort, something I hope you'll never need. But if things get complicated, this envelope contains the truth that can save us. Emily took the envelope carefully, feeling the weight of her grandfather's words. I promise to protect all of this, Grandpa. No matter what happens. I know, Emily. You're stronger than you realize. In the days that followed, small incidents began occurring at the Foundation's facilities. Important documents went missing, equipment was mysteriously damaged, and negative rumors started to spread. Though frustrated, Emily remained calm. During an emergency meeting with her team, David, who had been quietly listening from his chair, spoke with authority. We know who's behind this. We don't need to look far. Emily nodded, addressing her team with determination. If Julia wants to play dirty, we'll respond with integrity. Strengthen security, double-check everything. We won't let this stop us." As the Foundation braced itself for this new challenge, Julia pressed forward with her plan, convinced she could still regain control. But what she didn't realize was that every move she made was being closely monitored, and her downfall was drawing ever nearer. The following days were a whirlwind of actions and countermeasures at the Foundation. Emily reinforced security systems, hired experts to audit every aspect of the operations, and personally reviewed each report. Her calm and composed handling of problems earned her growing respect among her team, who began to see her as an unstoppable leader. Meanwhile, Julia, growing increasingly desperate, had managed to infiltrate someone into the Foundation's team, an administrative assistant feeding her confidential information and creating minor disruptions. Julia was convinced she was on the verge of toppling Emily. One afternoon, while Emily worked in the greenhouse, Inspector Ramirez arrived at the mansion with important news. "Miss Montenegro, we found evidence that Mrs. Julia Montenegro has been financing acts of sabotage against the Foundation. We now have enough proof to open a formal investigation." Emily, though relieved that Julia's actions were being uncovered, worried about the potential impact on the Foundation's reputation. "Inspector, is there any way to handle this discreetly? I don't want the Foundation's beneficiaries to be affected by this scandal." Ramirez nodded, impressed by Emily's maturity. "We'll do everything we can to protect the Foundation's name. But rest assured, Julia won't get away with this." That evening, Emily shared the news with David, who listened intently from his armchair in the main sitting room. "I knew Julia would sink even lower. But this is dangerous, Emily. Make sure you're always one step ahead," David said with a measured tone. Emily nodded, her resolve unshaken as she prepared to protect Clara's vision and the work they had accomplished together. Later that night, an unexpected event shook the Foundation. A fire broke out in the main warehouse, destroying equipment and materials intended for the next project. Upon hearing the news, Emily rushed to the scene with her team. The flames had already been extinguished, but the damage was extensive. Amid the charred remains, they discovered a message scrawled on the walls: "This isn't over." Emily felt a chill as she read the words. She knew Julia was behind this but also understood that fear could not be allowed to stop her. That night, Emily called an emergency meeting at the mansion. David, though visibly tired, insisted on attending. "We can't allow ourselves to be intimidated," Emily said firmly, addressing her team. "The Foundation is more than just buildings or equipment. It's an idea, a purpose, and that can't be destroyed." David, seated in his chair, nodded slowly. "Your grandmother would be proud of you, Emily. But remember, values don't always win battles. Sometimes, you need strategy." Emily took David's words as a challenge. She decided to hire a private investigator to gather more evidence against Julia and uncover who was helping her from within the Foundation. Meanwhile, Julia celebrated in her small apartment, convinced she had destabilized Emily. However, her infiltrated assistant began to have second thoughts. Witnessing Emily's dedication and honesty, he started questioning Julia's orders. One afternoon, the assistant requested a private meeting with Emily. "Miss Montenegro, there's something I need to confess," he said hesitantly. Emily listened calmly as he revealed how Julia had manipulated him into sabotaging the Foundation. Though anger simmered beneath her composed exterior, Emily felt compassion for the young man, who was clearly remorseful. "Thank you for coming to me. But this isn't over. I need your help to stop Julia." With the assistant's cooperation, Emily and the private investigator began piecing together a strong case against Julia. Gradually, the web of lies and manipulations was unraveled, exposing Julia's entire network of sabotage. That night, as Emily reviewed the final reports with the investigator, David entered the study. "Do you have everything you need?" he asked, pride evident in his voice. Emily nodded. "We're ready, Grandpa. Julia won't be able to hurt us anymore." David smiled, his expression calm, as he placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "I always knew you had the strength to face all of this. Clara would be so proud of you." As night fell over the Montenegro mansion, Emily prepared for the final confrontation with Julia, confident that the truth would ultimately prevail. With everything in place, Emily decided it was time to act. The following morning, she met with Inspector Ramirez at the foundation and handed over the evidence gathered by the private investigator, along with the testimony of the assistant Julia had manipulated. "This is enough to build a solid case against Julia Montenegro," Ramirez said, carefully reviewing the documents. Emily nodded, though her determined expression carried a hint of sadness. "It's not easy, Inspector. Julia is family, but I can't allow her hatred and ambition to continue harming what we've built." Ramirez regarded her with respect. "I understand, Miss Montenegro. Justice is rarely simple, but it is necessary." Meanwhile, in her small apartment, Julia began to feel the weight of her actions becoming unbearable. Michael, who had left her weeks earlier, called her one last time. "Julia, this has to stop. Everything you're doing is only making things worse." Julia, her eyes red from exhaustion and frustration, refused to listen. "You don't understand, Michael. They took everything from me. I can't just stand by and do nothing." Michael sighed on the other end of the line. "They didn't take it, Julia. You lost it because of your own choices." Julia hung up angrily, but her trembling hands betrayed her growing doubt. For the first time, a small spark of self-reflection began to flicker. That afternoon, Inspector Ramirez arrived with an official warrant. Julia was arrested at her apartment on charges of sabotage, conspiracy, and property damage. Though she resisted, she knew the evidence against her was overwhelming. At the Montenegro mansion, Emily received news of Julia's arrest with a mix of relief and sadness. She retreated to the greenhouse, where David found her sitting beside Clara's favorite flowers. "Are you all right, Emily?" he asked, leaning on his cane. "It's not a triumph, Grandpa. It's just something that had to be done." David nodded slowly, understanding the burden Emily carried. Justice never feels like a victory, but it's necessary to protect what's right. In the days that followed, the scandal surrounding Julia dominated local headlines. However, the community rallied around Emily in the foundation, showing overwhelming support. Letters, donations, and messages of encouragement poured in, recognizing Emily's efforts to preserve the family legacy. Meanwhile, Julia faced the consequences of her actions. In jail, she began reflecting on all she had lost. Michael visited her once, but their meeting was brief and cold. "I hope you find peace, Julia," he said before leaving her alone with her thoughts. At the foundation, Emily worked tirelessly to ensure that the projects continued uninterrupted. One afternoon, as she reviewed plans for a new community center, she received an unexpected visitor, Michael. "I wasn't expecting to see you here," Emily said, rising from her desk. Michael looked uncomfortable, but sincerity shone in his eyes. "I came to apologize, Emily. For everything. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I needed to say it." Emily looked at him silently for a few moments, then nodded. "We all make mistakes, Michael. What matters is what we do afterward." Though she didn't offer immediate forgiveness, her response was enough to give Michael a glimmer of hope. That evening, as the sun set behind the Montenegro mansion, Emily and David sat together in the greenhouse. Peace was slowly returning to their lives, though both knew the journey had not been easy. "Do you think all of this will someday just be a memory?" Emily asked, gazing at the flowers Clara had planted. David smiled softly. "Perhaps. But memories, even the difficult ones, are what make us stronger." Emily nodded, feeling a new strength growing within her. She knew her family's legacy was safe, but more importantly, she knew she had found her own place in the world. With Julia in custody and the foundation making strides with new projects, it seemed the storm had finally passed. However, Emily knew the Montenegro legacy still faced challenges, especially in building long-term trust within the community. One morning, as Emily reviewed documents in her office, she received an unexpected call from Inspector Ramirez. "Miss Montenegro, we have new developments in Julia's case. She's requested a hearing to make a statement. She claims to have information that could implicate others in the sabotage." Emily frowned, surprised by the turn of events. "Others? Are you saying she didn't act alone?" Ramirez sighed on the other end of the line. "That's what she's claiming. I recommend you attend the hearing. This could clarify a lot." Emily shared the news with David over breakfast. Though physically weakened, the patriarch remained a pillar of wisdom and support. "Julia is like a snake, Emily. If she's talking, it's because she wants something in return. Be cautious." Emily nodded, knowing she couldn't ignore the opportunity to uncover the full truth. At the hearing, Julia appeared escorted by guards. Her demeanor had changed, though still proud, there was a weariness in her eyes. As she sat before the judge, she glanced briefly at Emily, who remained composed beside her lawyer. "I'm here because I want to clear my conscience," Julia began, her tone seemingly sincere, though Emily kept her guard up. Julia confessed that she had received external support for sabotaging the foundation. She named Sebastian Varela, a longtime rival of the Montenegro family, as the financier behind some of the attacks, intending to discredit the family and ruin their reputation. "I did it because I was desperate," Julia admitted, but he exploited that desperation for his own gain. The revelation left everyone in the courtroom stunned, including Emily, who hadn't anticipated someone like Varela being involved. After the hearing, Emily met with Ramirez, who had already started investigating Varela's connections to the sabotage. "He's a powerful man, Miss Montenegro, but no one is above the law," the inspector assured her. That evening, Emily returned to the mansion, where David awaited her in the study. "How did it go?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already had an idea. Julia talked. She said Sebastian Varela was behind the attacks. David pursed his lips and nodded slowly. "Varela has always been an enemy of this family. But if he's involved, this goes far beyond Julia." Determined to protect the foundation, Emily began working with her legal team to strengthen the organization's administrative and financial defenses. She knew confronting Varela wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she wasn't alone. In the days that followed, news of Varela's involvement spread through the media, drawing widespread public attention. Many began questioning the businessman's motives, though he initially refused to comment. When Varela finally broke his silence, he vehemently denied any connection to Julia or the sabotage. "These accusations are absurd. The Montenegro family is simply looking for a scapegoat for their problems," he said in a televised interview, his smile cold and calculated. Watching the broadcast, Emily felt a mix of anger and indignation, but also a renewed sense of determination. "If he thinks he can intimidate us, he's wrong," she told David that evening as they watched the interview together in the sitting room. "He's always underestimated this family. That will be his greatest weakness," David replied, a spark of pride in his eyes. As the foundation continued its progress, Emily and her team worked tirelessly to gather evidence against Varela, collaborating closely with Inspector Ramirez. Every step of the investigation uncovered more connections between the businessman and the attacks, but Emily knew the battle was far from over. That night, as the mansion slept, Emily sat in the greenhouse, gazing at the flowers Clara had planted. Her mind was filled with strategies and plans, but also with hope. The road ahead was challenging, but she knew the Montenegro legacy was stronger than any enemy. And she was ready to defend it. The days that followed were a whirlwind of work for Emily and her team. The investigation against Sebastian Varela gained momentum, but the cunning and well-connected businessmen always seemed to be one step ahead. Meanwhile, the foundation continued its operations, though Emily constantly felt the weight of protecting what she had worked so hard to build. One afternoon, Inspector Ramirez arrived at the mansion with a critical update. Miss Montenegro, we've found financial records directly linking Varela to the sabotage. These include transfers to accounts used by Julia's accomplices, Ramirez said, handing over a folder of documents. Emily took the folder, her eyes scanning the contents. A mix of relief and anger welled up inside her. "Is this enough to bring him to justice?" she asked, her voice filled with determination. "It's a strong start, but we'll need more concrete evidence to ensure he can't slip away," Ramirez replied, adjusting his hat. That evening, Emily met with David in the study. Though age had slowed him physically, his eyes still gleamed with wisdom and resolve. "Grandpa, we have a chance to take him down, but it won't be easy. Varela has connections and resources that could complicate everything." David nodded slowly, leaning on his cane as he spoke. "Sebastián Varela has always been a dangerous man, Emily. But don't underestimate the power of the truth. When the world sees him for who he truly is, his influence will crumble." Emily knew her grandfather was right, but she also understood the importance of a solid strategy. She decided to organize a press conference to publicly expose Varela's ties to the sabotage. The next day, in the main hall of the foundation, Emily stood before a room full of journalists. With documents in hand and a firm posture, she began her statement. "In recent months, the foundation has faced attacks and sabotage that not only threatened our operations but also jeopardized the dreams of the communities we serve. Today, we are here to reveal that these were not isolated incidents. They were part of an organized plan, financed by Sebastián Varela." The room erupted in murmurs, and camera flashes illuminated the space. Emily continued, presenting the financial records and explaining how Varela had manipulated Julia to execute his plans. Varela's response was swift. That same evening, he appeared in a televised interview, coldly denying the accusations. "This is nothing more than a desperate ploy by the Montenegro family. The foundation is struggling, and they're using me as a scapegoat to divert attention," Varela said with a practiced smirk. Watching the interview, Emily's anger burned alongside her determination. "He thinks he can get away with this," she said to David, who sat beside her. "Let him talk, Emily. The more he says, the more he'll reveal about himself," David replied with the calm wisdom of experience. Meanwhile, in prison, Julia learned of the developments. Though she deeply resented Varela for exploiting her desperation, she also knew his downfall was inevitable. Deciding she had nothing left to lose, Julia offered to collaborate with the authorities, providing additional evidence to bolster the case against him. "If I'm going down, I'm not going down alone," she told Ramirez during a prison interview. With Julia's new information, Emily and Ramirez tightened the net around Varela. His every move was monitored, and the evidence against him grew rapidly. One night, as Emily worked late in her office, she received an unexpected call. "Miss Montenegro, this is Sebastián Varela." Emily's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. "What do you want, Mr. Varela?" "I want to offer you a deal. We can resolve this peacefully, without ruining each other's reputations." Emily clenched her jaw, suppressing her anger. "Justice isn't negotiable, Mr. Varela. Prepare to face the consequences of your actions." Varela chuckled coldly before hanging up. What he didn't know was that Emily had recorded the call, planning to use it as further evidence against him. As the case against Varela solidified, Emily felt, for the first time in months, that the truth was finally on her side. The battle was not yet over, but she knew she was closer than ever to protecting the legacy that Clara and David had worked so hard to build. The case against Sebastián Varela reached its climax as the evidence gathered by Emily, Inspector Ramirez, and Julia's testimony was officially presented to the authorities. The recording of the phone call between Emily and Varela proved to be the linchpin, revealing not only his disregard for the law but also his willingness to manipulate any situation for his personal gain. Days later, Varela was arrested at his luxurious residence, escorted by a team of officers while media cameras captured every moment. His normally confident expression was replaced with one of fury and humiliation. At the Montenegro mansion, Emily watched the live broadcast from the sitting room. David, seated beside her, nodded with quiet satisfaction as the images showed Varella's power beginning to crumble. "This is just the beginning, Emily. The hardest part comes now, rebuilding the trust he tried to destroy," David said, his tone calm but resolute. Emily knew her grandfather was right. Varella's downfall was a victory, but the damage he had caused to the Foundation's reputation and to the communities that depended on its project still needed to be repaired. That afternoon, Emily convened a meeting with her team to discuss the next steps. "Our priority is to refocus on our mission," she said, looking at the tired yet determined faces of her team. "Varella is no longer a threat, but we have to show the world that the Foundation remains a pillar of hope for those who need it most." David, though physically frail, joined the meeting. "I want to remind you of something," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "This legacy isn't just Emily's or mine. It belongs to all of you. What we've built here can't be destroyed by hatred or ambition." Inspired by David's words, the team set to work with renewed energy. Every project was reassessed, every delay was met with practical solutions, and every community affected by the sabotage received immediate attention. Meanwhile, in prison, Julia watched as Varella faced the consequences of his actions. Though she still resented her situation, she began to reflect on the harm she had caused, not only to the Foundation but to herself. One afternoon, she decided to write Emily a letter. "I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I regret what I've done. I know I can't undo my actions, but I hope that one day you'll find a little peace with what's happened," Julia wrote, leaving the letter with Ramirez to deliver to Emily. When Emily received the letter, she read it in the greenhouse, the place that always brought her comfort. As she finished, she didn't know whether to feel anger, sadness, or compassion. She placed the letter in a drawer, deciding she wasn't ready to respond. Days later, the Foundation held a community event to inaugurate a new education and recreation center, the first since Varella's attacks began. The local press attended, and Emily, with a speech filled with hope and determination, reaffirmed the Foundation's mission. "Today, we prove that no matter how great the adversity, we can rebuild. This center is more than a building, it's a symbol of our strength, our unity, and our ability to move forward." David, seated among the guests, clapped proudly as Emily's words echoed through the crowd. Though he knew his time in this world was nearing its end, he felt at peace knowing Clara's legacy, and the family's, was in the best hands. That night, back at the mansion, Emily sat with David in the greenhouse. Together, they gazed at the stars in silence, savoring a moment of calm after months of turmoil. "Do you think we've done it, Grandpa?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. David smiled softly, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "We've done it, Emily. But more importantly, you've done it. You've shown that true strength isn't in power or money, but in the heart." Emily took her grandfather's hand, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for all he had taught her. Though she knew challenges still lay ahead, she also knew she was ready to face them. Time seemed to stand still at the Montenegro mansion in the weeks that followed. Peace had finally returned, but it brought with it an air of melancholy. David, whose body could no longer keep up with the strength of his mind and spirit, spent most of his days in the greenhouse, surrounded by the flowers Clara had loved so dearly. One afternoon, Emily found him sitting beside a blooming rose bush. In his hands, he held an old photo album filled with memories of a life shared with Clara. "Come, Emily," he said, gesturing to the seat beside him. "I want to show you something." Emily sat down, watching as David carefully turned the pages. There were photos of weddings, birthdays, and everyday moments that spoke of love and devotion. "Each of these moments is a reminder of what it means to build something lasting," David said, his voice weak but full of meaning. "It's not about buildings or money, it's about the connections we make and the lives we touch." Emily nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She knew David was preparing her for the inevitable. That night, as the mansion fell silent, Emily woke with an unexplainable urge. She went to the greenhouse and found David asleep in his chair, surrounded by the flowers. As she approached, she realized her grandfather had passed away peacefully, a look of serenity on his face. The grief she felt was profound, but it was tempered by gratitude. David had lived a full life, leaving behind a legacy now entrusted to her. Days later, the Montenegro family and the community gathered to honor David's memory with a service held in the mansion's gardens. Emily, dressed in black, stood before the attendees with a strength that seemed to emanate from David's example. My grandfather, David Montenegro, was not just a leader but a beacon of hope and love, she said. He taught us that true wealth lies not in what we own but in what we give. Today, I promise to carry on his legacy with the same dedication he showed every day of his life. The crowd applauded with respect and emotion, and many came forward to share stories of how David had changed their lives. Emily realized that, though her grandfather was no longer physically present, his spirit lived on in every corner of the foundation and in every person touched by his kindness. In the weeks that followed, Emily devoted herself to expanding the foundation's vision. With her team's support, they began working on international projects, spreading the Montenegro legacy to communities beyond their borders. One afternoon, while reviewing plans for a new health center, she received a letter from Julia in prison. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, it read, but I want to thank you for keeping Clara and David's legacy alive. They always saw in you what I never could, an unbreakable strength. I hope that one day you'll find some compassion for me in your heart. Emily folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, still unsure whether she could forgive. But for the first time, she felt the weight of resentment beginning to lift. That evening, as she walked through the mansion's gardens, she stopped by Clara's favorite rose bush. A soft breeze enveloped her, and for a moment, she felt the presence of her grandparents, a quiet reassurance that their love and wisdom would always guide her. I promise, she murmured, looking up at the sky. I will never let your legacy fade. As the stars illuminated the night, Emily knew that the most important chapter in the Montenegro story was just beginning. Her mission now was to carry their light to every corner of the world. Over the months, Emily transformed the Montenegro Foundation into a global beacon of hope. The projects not only grew in number but also in impact, bringing education, health, and opportunities to marginalized communities worldwide. Yet, with each success, Emily felt the weight of the responsibility her grandparents, Clara and David, had entrusted to her. One morning, while reviewing reports in her office, she received an invitation to attend a global conference on social leadership. The event was to be held in Geneva, and the Montenegro Foundation had been nominated for a prestigious international award recognizing its humanitarian work. Emily traveled to the event accompanied by key members of her team. While the nomination was a great honor, for Emily, it was something more, an opportunity to inspire others and honor Clara and David's legacy on a global stage. During the conference, Emily stepped onto the stage to accept the award. The room was filled with leaders from around the world. Though she felt a lump in her throat, she took a deep breath and spoke from the heart. This recognition is not just for me or the Montenegro Foundation. It's for the people who taught us that true leadership lies in service. My grandparents, David and Clara Montenegro, believed deeply that a single act of kindness can transform lives. Today, I stand here to promise that we will continue working to ensure every community has the tools and opportunities to thrive. The audience rose in applause, but Emily felt no ego, only a profound sense of gratitude. On her way back to the mansion, Emily received an unexpected call from Inspector Ramirez. Miss Montenegro, I have good news. Julia has decided to participate in a rehabilitation program and has shown significant progress. It seems she's finally confronting her mistakes. Emily listened closely, processing the information. While the wounds of the past hadn't healed entirely, the thought that Julia was trying to change gave her a glimmer of hope. Thank you for letting me know, Inspector. Perhaps this is the start of something different for her. That evening, as she walked through the mansion's gardens, Emily reflected on how much her life had changed. From being a young woman often overlooked within her family to becoming a revered leader, she had come a long way. Yet what filled her with the greatest pride was knowing her grandparents' legacy lived on, not just in her, but in the countless lives they had touched. When she entered the greenhouse, she found a letter on the work table. It was from one of the children benefiting from the Foundation's projects. "Thank you, Miss Emily. Now I can go to school and dream of becoming a doctor someday. I promise to work hard so I can help others, just like you helped me." Emily smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. In moments like these, she understood the true purpose of her work, not only to change lives but to inspire others to do the same. As she stepped out of the greenhouse, she looked up at the stars, recalling David's words, "Every action, no matter how small, leaves a mark on this world." Emily knew there was still much to do, but she was ready to face each challenge, carrying with her the love, strength, and dreams of those who had believed in her from the very beginning. With the Montenegro Foundation achieving global recognition, Emily dedicated herself daily to consolidating new projects and amplifying the impact they had achieved in countless communities. Yet, as the Foundation's light shone brightly, an unexpected challenge began to emerge from the shadows. One day, while reviewing the quarterly financial reports, Emily noticed discrepancies in one of the accounts. Small transactions that didn't align with approved budgets caught her attention. Initially thinking it was an administrative error, she dug deeper and uncovered that funds had been diverted to an offshore account linked to an unfamiliar name, Samuel Arriaga. Emily immediately called a meeting with her finance and legal teams. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I want every cent traced, and I want to know who is behind this. The integrity of this foundation cannot be compromised." As her team worked, Emily contacted Inspector Ramirez, who began a parallel investigation. "This kind of embezzlement doesn't happen without someone inside facilitating it," Ramirez warned over the phone. "Be careful, Miss Montenegro. It could be someone close to your team." The idea of betrayal within the foundation hit Emily hard. She had worked tirelessly to create an environment of trust and dedication, but now she faced the unsettling reality that someone might be undermining everything they had fought for. Days later, the investigations yielded a name, Marcos Valdez, a project manager who had been with the foundation since its inception. Though he initially appeared to be an exemplary employee, the records revealed that he had collaborated with Samuel Arriaga to divert the funds. Still reeling from the revelation, Emily decided to confront him personally. "Marcos, I need to speak with you in private," she said, her calm exterior masking the anger and disappointment she felt. Marcos, sensing something was wrong, entered her office nervously. "What's this about, Miss Montenegro?" he asked. Emily placed the documents on the table, her gaze unwavering. "Explain this," she said, pointing to the transactions. At first, Marcos denied any wrongdoing. But as he realized the evidence was irrefutable, he finally confessed. "It wasn't greed, Emily. Samuel threatened me. He knew things about my past that could ruin my life, and I had no choice." Emily felt a mix of anger and compassion. While Marcos had betrayed her trust, it was clear he had also been a victim to some extent. "This doesn't excuse what you've done," she said firmly. "You jeopardized the work of hundreds of people and the trust we've built with the communities we serve." Emily decided to pursue legal action against Samuel Arriaga but offered Marcos a chance to cooperate to mitigate his culpability. "If you truly want to make this right, help me bring him down," she said, making it clear that there would be no further chances. With Marcos's cooperation and Inspector Ramirez's diligence, authorities traced Samuel Arriaga. They uncovered that he had used the embezzled funds to finance a network of corruption in charitable projects across the country. Arriaga's arrest became a high-profile case, and while the foundation emerged free of suspicion, Emily understood how close they had come to irreparable damage. That night, as she walked through the mansion's gardens, she found solace in remembering David's words: "Character is not measured in triumphs, but in how we face adversity." The next day, Emily gathered her team in the greenhouse, a place where she always found clarity. "What happened was a blow to all of us, but we cannot let it define who we are," she said, her voice steady yet passionate. "Let's learn from this and make our mission even stronger." The response was unanimous. Every team member reaffirmed their commitment to the foundation, and together they implemented stricter measures to ensure such a breach would never happen again. As the sun set behind the trees, Emily knew that while the path forward was challenging, she was building something resilient enough to weather any storm. The Montenegro legacy remained intact, and with each obstacle overcome, it grew even stronger. With the embezzlement scandal finally resolved, the Montenegro Foundation emerged stronger than ever. The new measures for transparency and security not only restored trust but also attracted new partners and donors who admired how Emily had handled the crisis. Yet, amid the success, Emily remained deeply connected to the values her grandparents, Clara and David, had instilled in her. One afternoon, as she walked through the halls of the mansion, Emily received a call that would change the course of her life. It was a representative from the United Nations. "Miss Montenegro, we've been following the work of your foundation closely, and we would like to invite you to join an international committee focused on implementing global sustainable development policies. Your experience and leadership would be invaluable." Emily, surprised but honored, humbly accepted the invitation. She knew this new role would not only expand the foundation's impact but also carry Clara and David's legacy to an even broader stage. The news was met with excitement at the foundation, but it also came with a difficult decision. Emily would need to spend more time traveling and working on global initiatives, meaning she would have to delegate much of the day-to-day management of the foundation to her team. She gathered everyone in the greenhouse, her sanctuary of clarity and reflection, to share the news. "This is not a goodbye. I'll always be here," she said, her voice steady but warm. "But I want you to know that I have complete trust in every one of you to carry on this work. The foundation is more than just one person, it's the collective effort we've built together." The team responded with heartfelt applause, knowing Emily had prepared them to step into greater leadership roles. Before leaving for her first international meeting, Emily made one final stop in the mansion's gardens. Sitting beside Clara's favorite rose bush, she closed her eyes and let memories wash over her. "I hope you're proud of me," she murmured, feeling the presence of her grandparents in the gentle breeze brushing her face. The journey to Geneva marked the beginning of a new chapter. Emily found herself at discussion tables with world leaders, sharing her experiences and learning from others' approaches. While the magnitude of her responsibilities sometimes felt overwhelming, she always remembered David's words: "Every small action leaves a mark." During a speech at the United Nations, Emily reflected on the foundation's beginnings and the influence of her family. "My grandfather, David Montenegro, always said that true wealth isn't in what we own but in what we leave in others. This principle has guided every decision I've made and remains the heart of our work." Her speech received a standing ovation, but for Emily, the most meaningful part was the conversations that followed. Every meeting, every collaboration was an opportunity to multiply the impact of the Montenegro legacy. Returning to the mansion after her trip, Emily found a letter from Julia, different from those she had received before. "I've heard about all you've accomplished, and though I don't deserve to say this, I'm proud of you. Clara and David always saw something in you that I couldn't appreciate. Thank you for proving them right." This time, Emily decided to respond. "Thank you for your words, Julia. Everyone deserves a second chance, including you. I hope you find peace in the journey you're on." The exchange marked the closing of a chapter that had remained unresolved for years. Over time, the Montenegro Foundation became one of the most respected organizations in the world. Emily, though ever modest, was recognized as one of the most influential leaders of her generation. Despite her accomplishments, her heart always belonged to the Montenegro mansion, where the values Clara and David had planted continued to bloom like the flowers in the greenhouse. One night, as she gazed at the stars from the gardens, Emily smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The Montenegro legacy had not only endured but transcended, reaching heights no one could have imagined. And Emily, with quiet determination and unwavering love, carried that legacy forward into a brighter future.